Hi guys, I Aziz welcome you to CoedMaster. Bind function is the most commonly used function available in JavaScript. And if you want to master JavaScript, it is really crucial to learn about bind function. In this video, we are going to dive deep into bind function. In this video, we will learn the purpose of bind function, what problem it solves, how it works internally, and in the last we will write our own implementation of bind function from scratch. So guys, I highly recommend to watch this video till the end in order to become better at JavaScript. Now without wasting any time, let's get started. Alright guys, on the left hand side you can see the app.js and on the right hand side you can see the terminal. Now in order to understand about the bind function, first we have to understand how this binding works in JavaScript. So to understand how this binding works in JavaScript, let's take a simple example. So let's create an object obj and let's define one property on this object with the name x and the value of this is 1. Now let's define another property with the name getX and it's going to be a function, and this function is going to accept some arguments. So let's call it arguments. Now we are going to print the value of x and arguments inside this function. Okay, let's call console.log, give it a value of x is going to be this dot x and the value of r. Great. Now let's try to call this function. So let's call object.get of x. Save the file and now run this file. Let's call npm run nodemon. Now if you look at the output, we are able to print the value of x and the value of argument is undefined. Why is it so? Because we have not passed the value of arguments. So let's pass 2 to this function, save the file, and you can see the value of arguments printed on the console. Value of x is 1 and value of arguments is 2. Great. So though we are able to successfully execute this script, but my question is, have you ever wondered how this script actually works? If not, then let's understand now. So guys, if you run this script, JavaScript engine is going to figure out two things. Number one is the from where this function is being called. We also call it call site. And second thing is how this function is being called. Okay, so in this case the call site is the app.js. okay, because we call this function directly on the app.js script. Second thing is how this function is being called. So we have called this function using object. Okay, now based on these two parameters, JavaScript engine decides the value of this. Okay, so in this case the JavaScript decides the value of this as this object. Why is it so? Because this object is the containing object of this function and also the enclosing object of this function. So that is why JavaScript engine decides the value of this as this object and assign this object to this keyword. So right now when we run this program, the value of this is pointing to this object, which is why we are able to print the value of x. Cool. Now let's pull out this function out of this object. So let's define one variable with the name function. Okay, and let's call obj.getX. So we have pulled this function out of this object. Now let's try to call this function. Okay, let's pass 2 over here. Let's save the file and let's see the output. Now you can see that the value of x is undefined and the value of arguments is 2 as before. Great. But here the value of x is undefined. So we need to figure out why the value of x is undefined here. Okay, so let's understand. Again, when we run this script, our JavaScript engine is going to figure out two things. One is the from where this function is being called and how this function is being called. So in this piece of code, in this case, the call site is also app.js, and this time we have not used any enclosing object, rather we have directly called this function. So in this case, both the parameters has same value, app.js and app.js. So in this case, the JavaScript engine decides the value of this as the window object, which is available globally. And you can see that we have not defined any variable or identifier on Windows object, which is why the value of x is given as undefined. Okay, I hope you got the point. In previous example, we have called this function using this object. This is going to be the enclosing object, which is why the value of this is bind to this object. And in this case, in this scenario, we have not called this function using any object. Instead, we directly call this function, which is why JavaScript engine decides the value of this as the window object, and we don't have any variable x on Windows object, which is why we are able to get the undefined as the value of x on the console. So this is how the value of this is decided or computed at runtime by JavaScript engine. Great. We are ready to understand the bind function now. So this is a problem for us, that we are losing this when we call this function outside of this object. How we are going to solve this problem? So to solve this problem, now the bind function comes into picture. So far we know that we are losing the value of this, and because of the function being called outside of object, the JavaScript engine pointing the this to Windows object. But we can fix this using the bind function. How can we fix this? Let's see it. So in this case, we can see that this function is going to be unbounded function. Unbounded function, right? Because it is not this value of this function is not bounded to anything else, rather but the windows. Now we can call unbounded function dot bind, and inside of bind we can call the value of this. So we want the value of this to be object, and then we want to pass argument as 2. Okay, so in return this bind function is going to return us a function, and this function is going to be the bounded function. Okay, so we get the function. Now we can simply call this function bounded function. Let's save the file, and you can see that we are able to fix the problem of this using the bind function, and now you can see the value of x on the console. And also we have passed one argument 2, and you can see the arguments over here. So the purpose which is solved by the bind function is simple, that whenever we have a situation where our this value is lost, then we can explicitly give the value of this using the bind function. Okay, great. So what it does basically, so when we call bind function on this function, we are explicitly giving the value of this and telling the bind function that, hey bind function, we want to call this function, and you have to define, or you have to point the value of this to this object, and also we are also passing the argument to it. So in return, the bind function is going to return us a function which is going to be a bound function, and when we call this bound function, we are able to fix this, and we can able to see the value of x and arguments on the console. Okay, so this is the purpose of bind function, to fix this value, and I also showed you how it works. Okay, now so far so great. Now it's time to implement our own custom bind function from scratch. Okay, so before we implement bind function, let's go to MDN documentation and see the syntax of bind function. So let's head over to browser. So here is a documentation of bind function, which is available as function.prototype.bind. So far so clear. Now let's scroll a little bit down, and you can see the syntax over here. So bind function is going to accept the 2 arguments. The one is this argument, and the second one is the remaining arguments, and you can pass n number of arguments into this function. Okay, now let's copy this bind and paste it over here. Okay, so bind is going to be a function, and this function is going to be accept 2 arguments. One is this argument, and the second argument is the rest of the argument. So here we're gonna use the rest operator to accept all the remaining arguments. So far so great. Now what this bind function returns? So this bind function returns a function. So we can also return function from here. Okay, like this. Now this bind function is going to call on an already existing function, right? And the value of this inside this bind function is going to be this function. Okay, let me repeat again. So we are going to call this bind function on the unbounded function. So inside of bind function, what is the value of this? It's simple, object before dot. So what is the object before dot? Unbounded function. And in JavaScript, function is also a callable object. Okay, so inside bind function, this represents the function on which the bind is called. So we are going to save this function in a variable. So it's going to be a function equal to this. Okay, so far so great. Now we are returning a function, and inside of this function we are going to call this function with the given this value. So how can we do it? We simply call function dot call, and we are going to pass this argument into this call function, and then we can pass the arguments over here like this. But this function can also accept the arguments. So let's call this arguments 1, args1, and let's call arguments 2 over here, and then we can merge both the arguments with the spread operator. So number 1 is the argument 1 and number 2 is the argument 2. Okay, as simple as that. So this is the final implementation of the bind function. Now let's understand why and what we are doing over here. So as I said that bind function is going to return a function. So here we are returning this function. Okay, and this function also accepts some arguments. So far so great. Okay, and this represents the function on which the bind function is called. So in this case, this is the function itself. And in this function, when this function is being called, we are going to call this function by fixing the value of this. So here we are taking the help of the call function. So call function is also another most commonly used function in JavaScript, which help us to fix the value of this. So here we are calling call function on this function by passing the value of this, and we are telling that whenever we call this function, please fix the value of this, or please point the value of this to this argument, and then whatever rest of the arguments we are getting from this function and this function, we are merging both the arguments and passing to this function. Okay, I hope this is little bit tough to understand, but let me call the bind function, and then the things will be clear to you. Okay, now instead of calling the existing bind function, now we are going to call our bind function. So here first of all I am pulling out the function out of this object, which is going to be the unbounded function. Then we are going to call unbounded.bind by giving the value of this to this object and give it a argument as 2, and then we are getting the bounded function, and then we are going to call the bounded function as before. And then if we save the file, you will see that the value of x is equal to 1 and the argument value is 2. If you pass more arguments, you will see more arguments over here, and if you pass arguments into this function, let's say 4, you will see all the arguments over here. Value of x is 1 and the value of arguments is 2, 3 and 4. So now again let's understand how this is working. So we are calling the bind function, which we have assigned on the function.prototype.bind property. Inside of bind function, this is pointing to unbounded function. Why is it so? Again, when the JavaScript engine runs the script, it's going to figure out the value of this, and this time it computed the value of this should be this function, unbounded function. So here you can say that this function is pointing to unbounded function. right? Cool. Now we are returning a function. So this statement is going to returning a function, which is this function. And when we call this function, then we are calling unbounded function dot call, because this function is representing unbounded function. Okay, so unbounded function dot call is another function in JavaScript. So this call function help us to set the value of this with the given value. So what is the given value? The given value is this argument. And what is this argument? This argument is nothing but the object which we are passing over here. And then simply it is accepting the arguments, as simple as that. So first, this function is also accepting the argument which we are passing over here, and again when we call this bounded function, we are also able to pass the arguments. So we are receiving these 4 over here, and then we are merging both the arguments and pass it as an array to unbounded function. And what is the unbounded function? Unbounded function is simply the getX function, where the value of this is pointing to this object, and then we are able to log the value of x in the arguments on the console. So I hope the entire thing of how bind function works is clear to you, and now I hope you are feeling more confident about the bind function and what is the purpose of bind function and what problem it solves. So that is pretty much about the bind function in JavaScript. Alright guys, this is all from my side for this video. If you learned something valuable from this video, then please hit the like button in order to make YouTube algorithm happy. Please subscribe to this channel and don't forget to click the bell icon so my friend you never miss any upcoming videos. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.